At this age, they develop fast. Their muscles grow stronger. They're eager to take risks.
Desenvolveu programa que garante a todos os alunos excelência física.
Man who carves gnomes to children still young enough to delight in tales of the little people.
Do you remember those funny school things? The awkward, goofy, unforgettable bits of childhood you somehow forgot? In classrooms back then, these quirky supplies and weird routines were just part of growing up, whether you liked them or not. Isn't it strange how the stuff we once rolled our eyes at now makes us smile? They buzzed, they flickered, they hummed louder than the entire class combined. Overhead projectors were the high-tech marvel of the school day, and if you went to school in the 1970s or 1980s, you definitely remember the smell of overheating plastic sheets and the teacher wrestling with a transparency that was curling at the corners. The teacher would write with those squeaky markers that stained everything, always forgetting which way the transparency was supposed to face, and then flip it over while we all tried not to laugh. The bulb inside got hot enough to fry an egg, and you could always count on the glass surface being covered in smudges and fingerprints from the last 5 lessons. And of course, someone would always touch the glass while it was on, get mildly burned, and act like they were dying. Teachers would scold us not to lean on the cart, but we all did anyway. The shadow of the teacher's hand waving across the screen somehow made the whole class lose focus. The projector sat on that rickety wheeled cart, usually missing at least one rubber stopper so it would roll if the teacher moved too fast. And when it finally broke or needed a bulb change, forget it. That was the end of learning for the day. It was awkward, it was clunky, but somehow it was magic. And when the projector turned on, we all leaned in just a little closer, mostly to see if something would catch fire. You were half asleep, the lights were off, and suddenly, beep. That was your cue. Someone, usually the most nervous kid in class, had to turn the knob to advance the film strip 1 frame at a time. And it never went smoothly. The teacher would fumble with the cassette player, pressing rewind and play too many times while the film strip clicked forward with a wobble. The narration always sounded like someone had just woken up and read a textbook out loud. It droned on about volcanoes or the water cycle while the tiny slides advanced, slightly blurry and crooked. Every kid sat there pretending to care, but we all lived for the next beep. And if you were the one in charge of turning the strip, the pressure was enormous. Miss the beep, and the whole room groaned. Go early, and the teacher gave you the look. The film strip itself would fall out of alignment halfway through, and then the teacher had to stop the tape and try to fix it while everyone giggled in the dark. It was chaos disguised as learning, and yet it felt like a treat. The room went dark, the windows glowed, and for 30 minutes nobody had to raise their hand or do math. Just sit, listen, and wait for the next beep. Honestly, that sound lives rent-free in our brains to this day. There it was, taped to the bulletin board in all its laminated glory, the classroom job chart. Everyone had a role: line leader, door holder, calendar updater, and the much-feared bathroom monitor. Your name, written on a clothespin, got moved around weekly, even though the same kids always ended up doing the actual work. Being line leader was the crown jewel of the chart, and if you got it, you strutted through the hallway like you were royalty. Paper passer was a close second, only because you got to walk around while everyone else stayed seated. But let's be honest, the worst job was board cleaner. No one wanted to smear yesterday's chalk dust around with a crusty rag. And when you were stuck with plant waterer, that meant you were officially on leaf duty for a sad spider plant hanging on by a thread. Clothespins always fell off. Someone always lost theirs. The system worked about half the time, and yet teachers clung to it like it was sacred. The job chart was supposed to teach responsibility. What it really taught us was that fairness was just a concept, and that Becky was always going to get line leader 2 weeks in a row. Still, you checked it first thing Monday morning, every time, because that clothespin, at least for a moment, meant you had a title. They came in a plastic box that clicked shut like a treasure chest. Smelly markers, the forbidden fruit of the school supply shelf. You were not supposed to smell them, but everyone did. Cherry, grape, root beer, licorice, Why was there always licorice? Every color had its own scent, and if you got the black marker, you were either brave or had no taste buds left. The teacher would say, "These are for coloring, not for sniffing." But you knew she was lying. She sniffed them too. You had a favorite scent and a least favorite, and trades were serious business. If someone left the cap off, you gasped in horror. It was like wasting gold. There was always one marker that got crushed or lost under the radiator, and its scent would haunt the room forever. And the red marker? It smelled like cherry cough syrup and made half the class gag. You knew you were not supposed to do it. You knew it probably gave you a headache. But the second you opened the box, the instinct took over. The smell of those markers defined elementary school. They were a little dangerous, a little gross, and absolutely irresistible. And if you say you never took a big sniff, you're lying. The chalkboard was a massive green wall of stress. The teacher scribbled across it with dusty precision, filling it with math problems or spelling lists that ghosted even after being erased. But the real fun came at the end of the day when someone got picked to clean the erasers. It sounded like a reward, but it was a trap. You carried the erasers outside, banged them together until a cloud of chalk exploded in your face, and returned to class looking like a powdered donut. It never felt clean enough. The chalk got on your shirt, your face, in your hair, and somehow up your nose. But it was still an honor to be chosen. Some days you got to spray the board with water and use a felt rag to wipe it down, leaving streaks behind like abstract art. Other times you just smeared the dust around with a dried-out sponge. Still, it felt important. It felt like part of the day, and for a few minutes you were not just a student, you were part of the cleanup crew, keeping the room in shape. Plus, it got you out of your seat, and that was always worth it. They were the size of drumsticks, dull at the tip, and impossible to sharpen. Those big red pencils were supposed to help us learn penmanship, but mostly they just gave us hand cramps. Every worksheet had lines stacked on lines, and every letter had to hit the dotted center just right. Uppercase, lowercase, loop the G, tuck the tail of your J, nothing felt natural, and everything smudged. And that pink eraser on the end? Useless. It just smeared everything and tore the paper, but the teacher still made you use it. Your pencil case barely held the thing, and when it finally broke in half from sharpening too much on the wall crank sharpener, you were secretly relieved. You tried to make your cursive pretty. You tried to stay within the lines, but really, you just hoped the teacher would not call you up to write on the board. Somehow, those giant pencils made us feel smaller, but they also made us laugh and groan through every loop, line, and lopsided capital D. When you saw the television cart being wheeled in, everything else stopped. A boxy black set strapped to the top of a metal cart meant one thing. Today was not a real school day. Teachers sighed with relief. Kids cheered like it was a holiday. You were either getting a documentary about volcanoes or a grainy animated short with questionable voice acting. Sometimes the TV would buzz and roll the picture until someone smacked the side. The antenna never worked, and if it was a substitute teacher, it was basically guaranteed. The rolling cart always squeaked, and the cords trailed behind like a hazard waiting to happen. The janitor probably fixed it 10 times a year. The best days were when the lights were off, the curtains were closed, and the teacher told you to take notes while no one even pretended to. You sat in rows, staring at the fuzzy screen like it was a gift from the heavens. That cart was heavy. That screen was small. But when it entered the room, it felt like a break from the usual, and that made it gold. You had to ask for permission. You got up, walked to the front, and made eye contact with everyone along the way. Then came the sound, grinding, loud, and just a little embarrassing. Wall-mounted pencil sharpeners were noisy and unpredictable, chewing up pencils like they had a personal grudge. You never knew how far to crank. One turn too many and your pencil became a useless nub. One turn too few, and it barely made a point at all. Some kids turned it into a performance. They cranked for 30 seconds just to make noise. Others tried to sneak one quick grind and ended up showering the floor in shavings. The clear plastic casing always got stuck. The blades dulled fast. And if someone dared sharpen a colored pencil, The entire class turned against them. Still, it was a rite of passage. Your turn at the sharpener meant you got out of your seat, even if just for a moment. It was noisy, it was clunky, and it was oddly satisfying. It looked easy, just pinch and pull, but those little paper milk cartons were folded like a puzzle from the future. You opened it wrong? Instant milk explosion. You opened it right? Still probably spilled. Some kids poked a straw in the side, others ripped the top completely off. It always smelled a little sour. You never trusted the date stamped in purple ink. And somehow, chocolate milk was colder than the white milk, every time. Lunch trays clattered, someone dropped their milk. The janitor sighed, and there was always one kid who drank 4 cartons without blinking. You drank yours fast. It never tasted great. But it was cold, and it was part of the routine. And if you could get the flap open in one try, you felt like a champion. Those little cartons taught us patience and how to mop up messes fast. They clanged when they dropped and chipped like old cars. Metal lunchboxes were an essential part of school life, and your design said everything about you. Scooby-Doo, Dukes of Hazzard, Strawberry Shortcake, your box had to match your soul. Inside was the matching thermos, often broken, leaking tomato soup by third period. You had a sandwich in a baggie, a handful of pretzels, maybe a cookie if you were lucky. And your thermos? Always had that weird plastic smell. The metal dented if you sat on it. The handle always cracked, but it was still cooler than a brown bag. You lined them up on the shelf, compared characters, and fought over whose was better. Sometimes you got a new one for Christmas, and that was a huge deal. They were loud, they were awkward, but they were yours. And somehow, no matter how many dings or leaks, they made lunch feel like an event. The second you saw the purple ink, you knew it was go time. Timed multiplication drills printed on ditto sheets were the stuff of sweaty palms and pencil-breaking panic. The clock started, and your brain emptied. Suddenly, 6 times 7 was a mystery, and 8 times 8 felt like quantum physics. The ink smelled weird, sweet and chemical, almost like old perfume. You secretly sniffed the page before starting. Everyone did. Then the teacher said, "Go," and the room filled with frantic scribbling and suppressed groans. You always tried to beat the kid next to you, but if you finished too fast, it looked suspicious. Messy handwriting meant automatic red marks, and heaven forbid you skipped one. The teacher would circle it in red like it was a federal offense. If you got a perfect score, your paper went on the wall. If not, you just hoped it did not come back with too much red. These drills were meant to make you faster, but mostly they made you dread anything involving numbers. Still, when the time was up and you slammed your pencil down with a gasp, it felt like surviving a small war. Math trauma aside, there was something oddly satisfying about filling in every box, especially if you actually got them right. You flipped to the inside cover and there it was, a manila pocket glued to the back of the book, holding a yellowed card filled with names and stamped dates. Before barcodes and scanners, this was how you checked out library books. It was simple. It was analog. It was kind of brilliant. You wrote your name on the line, the librarian stamped the due date with that loud chunk, and the book was yours for 2 weeks. Seeing someone else's name on the card made the book feel worn in, like it had history. You always wanted your name to be on the card more than once. It made you feel like a true fan. And if your crush had signed it first, that book became sacred. The pockets always peeled at the edges. The cards were usually a little bent, but that was part of their charm. If you lost a book, that card came back to haunt you, stamped over and over like a permanent record of failure. But if you returned it on time, it felt like winning. These little pockets turned books into memories, made you feel seen, and added a tiny thrill to every checkout. And to this day, you probably still remember the smell of that library: dust, paper, and possibility. The teacher yanked it down with a dramatic flourish and immediately regretted it. Pull-down maps were the ultimate classroom gamble. They unrolled with a creak, hung crookedly, and never ever rolled back up on the first try. There was one for every subject: the United States, ancient civilizations, rainfall distribution, something involving tectonic plates. You never knew which one would appear, or how long it would take to wrestle it into place. When the teacher tried to roll it back up, it would stop halfway, or shoot up too fast and slap the roller with a deafening bang. And that was the most exciting part of geography class. Sometimes the pull cord snapped, leaving the map stuck forever. Sometimes the corners curled and made everything look like a pirate treasure hunt. You would stare at the map instead of listening to the lesson, tracing borders and imagining road trips. If you were lucky, the teacher would forget to pull it back up and it would just hang there, blocking the chalkboard like a misplaced curtain. They were wrinkled, outdated, and unpredictable. But when the map came down, you knew it was time to learn something. Maybe. Or at least time to laugh when it snapped back up like a mousetrap. They were made of wood, metal, and pure chaos. The desks with lift-up tops were designed to store your books, but mostly they stored mess, forgotten notes, and gum wrappers. You lifted the lid carefully, unless you were mad, in which case you slammed it for effect. The hinges squeaked. The inside smelled like paper and pencil shavings, and there was always a pencil stuck at the bottom that no one could reach. Opening one too fast made it crash like thunder. And if you accidentally pinched your finger in the hinge, you remembered that pain for life. They were part desk, part booby trap. You were supposed to keep them organized. You never did. At any moment, the teacher could ask you to open it for a surprise desk check. Cue silent panic and fast shuffling. You decorated the inside with stickers or doodles, passed secret notes through them, hid snacks when no one was looking. They were noisy, they were heavy, but they were yours. And nothing beat that sound when the whole class slammed them shut at the end of the day. It was thick, white, and came in a little bottle with a soft orange rubber tip. Classroom glue in the 1970s and 1980s was its own species of weird. You had to squeeze the bottle just right or risk a sudden glue explosion or nothing coming out at all. The tip always dried shut, crusted over, and had to be picked clean with a bent paper clip or the corner of a ruler. But once it worked, you were in business. The smell was strong and oddly familiar. You were not supposed to sniff it, but you did anyway. And someone in class definitely tasted it, at least once. You used it for construction paper collages, cotton ball snowmen, and diorama disasters. It wrinkled notebook paper like crazy and took forever to dry. Kids would smear it on their hands just to peel it off in one satisfying sheet. It was equal parts craft supply and toy. It never glued quite right, but it was part of every project, and somehow, it made you feel like an artist. Sticky fingers, weird lumps and all. There was something magical about watching the teacher lift the needle and gently lower it onto a spinning vinyl. The soft crackle of static meant it was story time. A narrator's voice would float out of the speaker, calm and slow, while you sat cross-legged on carpet squares. The books had matching records with that turn the page when you hear the tone chime. But no one ever waited for the chime. You just flipped when the kid next to you did. If the record skipped, the story repeated itself endlessly. And if someone bumped the player, you got yelled at like it was a national emergency. But when it worked, it was pure classroom peace. The record player sat on a low cart with built-in storage and tangled cords. Most of the records were scratched, and some skipped so much you could recite the page from memory. But when that needle dropped and the room got quiet, it felt like a break from real schoolwork. You were still learning, technically. But mostly, you were being transported, somewhere far away from math and spelling drills. And that scratchy voice from the vinyl still echoes in your memory, page-turn chime and all. The ruler lived on the teacher's desk. It was not for measuring, it was for reminding. A loud smack on the desk was the warning, and everyone straightened up real fast. You knew which teachers meant it and which ones just liked the drama. Either way, the sound was enough to stop whispers and mid-passing notes. Sometimes they would point with it. Other times they would just hold it up like a sword. One tap, and you felt it in your bones. Even the most talkative kid would zip it when that ruler got waved. It had this unspoken authority, 12 inches of wood and terror. Sometimes teachers tapped it rhythmically while they talked, and everyone froze. You watched it like it might come to life. It was practically a co-teacher. You never actually saw anyone get smacked, at least not at your school, but the stories went around. Last year, a kid got smacked for talking during a test. So-and-so got it for cheating. Maybe they were just stories, but you did not want to find out. That little wooden stick was pure power, and somehow, a 12-inch piece of wood managed to keep an entire room in check. Kind of makes you wonder if fear really is the best classroom management. You got them on the first day of school, thin, shiny, stretchy plastic covers that were supposed to protect your textbooks. They never fit quite right, always too tight or too loose. And by the end of week 1, they were ripped, curling, or completely gone. You were supposed to label them neatly, but the ink never dried, and it smudged into a blurry mess before lunch. The corners always split open. The spine would stretch until it looked like it was ready to snap. And the clear ones? Always yellowed like they had aged 10 years overnight. By Halloween, the covers were cracked like dried leaves. You kept taping them, but it was hopeless. They slipped off mid-class and flopped onto the floor like a dead fish. You got in trouble for not having them on, even though everyone knew they never lasted. It was a yearly ritual of defeat. Some kids made their own covers from paper grocery bags. Those actually worked better. But you tried to make the plastic ones last because your teacher said you had to. They peeled, cracked, and slid off every time you opened the book, and eventually they just disappeared entirely. By mid-year, everyone's textbooks were naked, and no one cared. They were supposed to keep things neat. Instead, they taught us that some things are just not built to last. You stared at it all day, the giant wall clock ticking so slowly you swore it was broken. And half the time it was. The second hand would twitch, then freeze. Or it would spin wildly for no reason and land back in the same spot. The numbers were huge. The frame was yellowed. And yet, it ruled the room like a dictator. You would check it constantly, hoping it had moved 5 minutes. It never had. You would blink, look again, and it had somehow gone backward. When you were watching it, it moved slower. When you ignored it, the class flew by. Teachers would glance up and sigh like it had betrayed them again. Everyone learned to subtract 5 minutes from whatever it said. That clock controlled the vibe of the room, even if it was lying. Teachers would glance at it, then glance at their watches because even they knew it was lying. If someone asked, "What time is it?" you did not trust the answer unless you saw it on a digital clock. And yet, when the final bell rang, it somehow always caught up. It was clunky, it was wrong, but it was school law. And to this day, you probably still glance at a wall clock and wonder if it is telling the truth. You knew it was coming and it still made you jump. The school bell was not a ding. It was a screeching metal clang that echoed through your chest and rattled the windows. It meant change. Class was over, lunch had started, the day had begun. But it never came quietly. It sounded like an emergency, every single time. And no one could ever talk over it, not even the teacher. The first ring of the day jolted your spine like a car alarm going off in your ear. You would wince, grip your desk, and glance around like you had survived something. It made quiet moments explode. Even if you were expecting it, it felt like it came out of nowhere. It was the soundtrack to your school years, loud, abrupt, and weirdly comforting. You would flinch, pause, then move like a herd. Sometimes you had 30 seconds to get across the building. Other times, the bell rang for no reason, and everyone looked around in confusion. Fire drills used the same bell, just longer, so every ring felt like a gamble. It was loud, it was abrupt, and somehow, we all just accepted it. Because nothing says time to learn like a sound that could wake the dead. There was nothing innocent about tetherball. It looked simple, just a ball on a rope tied to a pole. But on the playground, it turned into full-on combat. One kid served, the other returned, and then it was all wild swings and bruised knuckles. The goal? Wrap the rope entirely around the pole, past the other player's outstretched hands. Easy to say, nearly impossible to pull off. The ball was always slightly deflated, the rope frayed, The pole leaned at a suspicious angle from years of abuse. And still, it was the most competitive game on the blacktop. There were no referees, just pride and yelling. And when the ball smacked someone in the face, game over. Everyone scattered like they had seen a crime. Arguments were constant. Did it go around 3 times or 4? Was that a legal hit or a hold? Someone always stormed off, usually muttering about fairness and never playing again. Your knuckles would sting for the rest of the day. You wore the red mark like a badge of honor. Some kids trained between recesses, practicing their spins. If you were good, you ruled the playground. If you were not, you hoped for mercy. But the next day, they were back in line, hand on the pole, ready for redemption. The best players had strategies. They slammed the ball high or low, switched hands, and spun the rope fast enough to create wind. The rest of us just tried not to get hit. And the worst part? The bell always rang right when it got good. You walked back inside with red palms, dusty knees, and a mix of rage and pride. Tetherball was not just a game, it was recess royalty. They hung above the chalkboard like ancient scrolls, long laminated strips showing every cursive letter from A to Z. Uppercase, lowercase, all in perfect swoops and loops that looked nothing like your own handwriting. Every classroom had one. It was supposed to guide you. Instead, it judged you silently. The letters floated up there like some unattainable standard. The capital Q looked like a number 2. The lowercase z looked like a mistake, and every time you tried to copy them, your paper turned into a mess of crooked squiggles. Teachers pointed to the strip like it held the answers to life itself. "Look up there," they would say, as if that would magically fix your chicken scratch. But no matter how many times you looked, your cursive still looked like spaghetti. You practiced over and over, convinced that someday it would click. But for most of us, it never did. Your G's looked like S's, and your F's always looked like someone tripped while drawing. Still, that strip never moved. It stayed there all year, unwavering, a reminder that perfect penmanship was apparently possible, just not by you. You tried your best. You traced. You erased. You rewrote entire words just to make them passable, and then you crumpled the paper anyway. The cursive strip was not just decoration. It was the bar you could never quite reach, and somehow it became one of the most iconic things about every classroom. You raised your hand and whispered the most sacred phrase in elementary school. "Can I go to the bathroom?" The teacher nodded, reached into the drawer, and handed you the hall pass. And depending on your school, that meant carrying a grimy plastic lanyard or a chunk of painted wood the size of a brick. Some passes had the classroom number on them. Others were shaped like stop signs or cartoon characters. But they all had one thing in common. They were always slightly sticky. You held it like it was a golden ticket, like it gave you VIP access to a hallway no one else could enter. And you prayed you did not run into the kid from 5th grade who liked to ask why you were out there. You walked slow. You checked the mirror. You took the long way back to class. The pass gave you a few moments of freedom, outside the classroom walls, out of the teacher's gaze. But if you lost it, game over. Teachers flipped. You got the talk. And the next person to ask to leave got a scowl and a lecture about responsibility. Sometimes the passes were on clips or cords that had clearly been chewed by generations of students. Sometimes they had rules written in Sharpie, "Do not abuse privilege." But you still did. Because with the pass in your hand, you were untouchable for at least 3 glorious minutes. A little power went a long way. You saw it in the stack on the teacher's desk. Thin, colorful, and filled with stories that tried really hard to sound interesting. Weekly Reader Day was the one time reading in class did not feel like work. You flipped it open to find a mix of science, social studies, and weird fun facts about presidents, frogs, or the solar system. The paper felt rough. The ink smelled like it came straight from a mimeograph machine. And the stories? Always just a little bit behind the times. Every article ended in a question like, "What would you do in this situation?" which none of us ever answered seriously. There were quizzes we always guessed on and debates no one took seriously. But we still circled our choices with full confidence. There was always a word search or a crossword in the back, and if you finished your classwork early, that was your reward. You could rip it out, fold it into a booklet, or doodle in the margins until your desk looked like a sketchpad. Teachers liked it because it counted as reading. Kids liked it because it felt like a break. And once in a while, an article would stick with you, just enough to surprise you on a quiz 2 years later. Weekly Reader was not just a magazine, it was a mini escape, a chance to learn something without knowing you were learning. And somehow it made Thursdays feel special. Every classroom had one, usually on the side wall or in the back, covered in frayed construction paper and tattered borders that had seen better days. The themes changed: back to school, fall into reading, be a math wizard. But the look stayed the same: slightly wrinkled, slightly crooked, and somehow always charming. Letters cut out from stencils were stapled up with pride. Some were peeling, some were missing, and that one R always looked like a B because someone cut it too fast. There were always pun-based messages like "We're nuts about books" with paper squirrels. The teacher would staple up gold stars and pretend we earned them all. And no matter how messy it got, it stayed up way past the season it was meant for. In September, the apple cutouts looked fresh. By November, they were sagging from humidity or poked with pencil holes. Sometimes your work went up there, your best story, your best drawing. And even though no one really looked at it, knowing it was on the board made your whole week. Teachers spent hours after school making it look nice. We spent minutes trying to read it before zoning out again. It was colorful, it was hopeful, and even in its faded, staple-studded state, it gave the classroom life. It might not have been perfect, but it reminded you that school was a place worth decorating. You knew it was going to be a good day when the lights went out and the film strip projector came out. That low whir, the faint hum, and the little beep that told the teacher it was time to click to the next slide. Beep, click, and again, beep, click. In the 1970s, these things were everywhere in schools. Educational videos were not on YouTube. They were printed on transparent frames and wound into a reel like some old Hollywood mystery. The narrator always sounded like he was reading out of a phone book, and the animations were, well, let's just say, budget-friendly. But you still loved every second, because it meant no notes, no tests, just sitting back and hoping the teacher forgot the lights were off. Every class had that one projector that only half worked. The lens was always dusty. The bulb would burn out mid-lesson. Sometimes it was backwards or upside down. But you watched anyway. Whether it was about how plants grow, the water cycle, or some animated duck teaching math, the film strip was a golden break from routine. It turned classrooms into tiny theaters. It turned teachers into projectionists, and it turned students into slack-jawed kids staring at a flickering wall, completely content. Back then, there was no digital gradebook, no password-protected portals. Teachers had a clipboard, a piece of chalk, and one of the cruelest traditions you could imagine. Grades were posted, on the wall, the blackboard, or taped outside the classroom. Your name, your score, there for everyone to see. The top kids beamed with pride. The rest of the class felt the slow crawl of shame. Students learned their rank by how low their name appeared on the list. This was not about motivation, it was control. A way to keep students in line with fear of public failure. If you asked about privacy, people would have laughed. Privacy was not the point, visibility was. Today we call this a breach of confidentiality. We call it unacceptable. But in the 1970s, it was everyday life. Some kids worked harder to climb that list, others gave up entirely, and some just remembered that sinking feeling, the moment their friends saw that red pen's score next to their name. You do not forget something like that. You carry it, even now. Rubik's Cubes sat on coffee tables like miniature monuments to frustration. Their colorful sides promised fun, but more often delivered rage. You twisted, you turned, you thought you had it, and then disaster. One wrong move sent you back to square one. Solving it became a badge of honor. If someone at school could actually complete a Rubik's Cube, they were treated like a genius. Crowds gathered, applause broke out, but most of us faked it. We peeled off the stickers and rearranged them to make it look solved. Or we popped out the pieces and snapped them back into place. Technically cheating? Maybe. Spiritually rewarding? Absolutely. There were books, guides, even videos explaining how to beat the cube, but few had the patience. And yet, we all kept trying. Rubik's Cubes lived in junk drawers, backpacks, and classroom desks. They were part toy, part puzzle, part stress test. Looking back, they were frustrating, addictive, and completely iconic. And to this day, if you spot one on a shelf, your hands remember the rhythm of twist, turn, twist, even if your brain still has no idea how to actually solve it. Tang was not just a drink, it was a symbol of the future. Pitched as the beverage astronauts drank in space, this orange-powdered miracle made you feel like you were participating in the space race from your own kitchen. Every kid wanted Tang. Every mom kept a jar in the cupboard. All you needed was water and a spoon, and suddenly you were sipping the same stuff that orbited the Earth. It was sweet, artificial, and packed with flavor. And it made you feel cool. The powder never fully dissolved, which meant gritty sips near the end were just part of the experience. If you got the scoop size right, you earned that perfect bright orange glow. Too much, and it was syrupy sludge. Too little, and it was just sad orange water. Tang was more than a drink, it was a cultural event. The jar was wide and squat with a screw-on lid, and every household seemed to have one. Kids felt proud making it on their own. No adult needed. It became the go-to for lunch, after school, and Saturday cartoons. You never questioned the science behind it. You just knew that if it was good enough for NASA, it was good enough for you. That dusty scoop brought the cosmos into your kitchen. Back when playgrounds had more dirt than rubber mats, kids played jacks and marbles like it was an Olympic sport. Recess was your window of freedom in the 1970s, and all you needed was a small drawstring bag of marbles or a tin of jacks and a rubber ball. You sat cross-legged on the concrete, eyes locked in, hands steady. Bounce, scoop, catch. That was the rhythm. You started with onesies, then moved to twosies, all the way up to the impossible tensies. Marbles had their own code. You traded them, battled with them, and gave them ridiculous names. Cat's eyes, shooters, steelies. The good ones never left your pocket. There were rules, sure, but most of it was made up as you went. Some days you lost everything. Other days you walked off like a champion with your pockets full. These games taught more than coordination. They taught fairness, strategy, and a little bit of heartbreak. And they never required batteries. Just gravity, skill, and a surface to play on. Kids today might not know the thrill of hearing that tiny ball bounce or watching your favorite marble knock an opponent's clean out of the ring. But we remember. It might sound made up, but there were high school teachers in the 70s who smoked with their students. That is right, not just around them, but beside them. Sharing lighters, trading brands, sometimes even chatting like old friends on the back steps of the gym or near the baseball field. If you were 16 or 17, you could get away with it. Teachers would look the other way, or light one up too. This was especially common in small towns or schools without strict enforcement. The message was clear. This is adult territory now. You made it. There was even a kind of bond formed between the cool teacher and the seniors. It blurred every line. It made school feel more like a hangout than a place of learning. Today, this would be grounds for immediate suspension or worse. Smoking with students is seen as wildly inappropriate and dangerous. But in the 1970s, it was more of a gray area, and some students saw it as a rite of passage, a memory, a secret shared with the one teacher who got it. But looking back now, what they really got was permission to pick up a habit that stayed with them for decades. The gym climbing rope was the final boss of physical education. It dangled there from the ceiling like some cruel test of strength, taunting every kid in the room. In the 1970s, this rope was legend. You either loved it or dreaded it, but you definitely never forgot it. The floor mats underneath were paper thin. The rope itself was rough, frayed, and smelled like old sweat and wood polish. Climbing it meant using every muscle in your body while the entire class watched you inch upward like a nervous sloth. Some kids zipped to the top like it was nothing. Others barely got off the ground. The gym teacher always shouted, "Use your legs! Use your legs!" Like that helped. If you reached the ceiling, you got to ring a little bell or just tap the rafter. Victory. You felt like a hero. If you slid down too fast, you got rope burn that stuck around for days. Sometimes the rope twisted as you climbed, spinning you like a chicken on a rotisserie. Still, we tried. Every single time. Because climbing that rope meant something. It meant you were strong, brave, capable. Even if it ripped up your hands or left you sore for a week, you went home feeling 10 feet tall. If you were left-handed in the 1970s, good luck. Many teachers believed left-handed writing was wrong, or at least something that needed to be corrected. You were told to switch hands. Your left hand was tapped with a ruler, sometimes tied behind your back during penmanship drills. You were forced to hold the pencil with your right, no matter how awkward or unnatural it felt. Why? Old myths, religious beliefs, even outdated psychology. Some teachers thought being left-handed was a sign of rebellion. Others said it would ruin your handwriting. And so, they changed it. Or tried to. Kids were punished for writing naturally. Notes sent home, points off for smudging ink. Some gave up and adapted, others fought back. But either way, the message was loud. Different was wrong. Today, we understand that handedness is biological. We embrace it. But back then, your dominant hand was just another thing to erase. Some kids still remember how it felt to write against their own instincts, and how the teacher's approval was always out of reach. Cabbage Patch Kid frenzy turned toy stores into battlegrounds. These soft-bodied dolls with unique, slightly odd faces were the must-have gift of the 1980s. Each one came with a birth certificate and adoption papers, making it feel like you were bringing home a real baby. But getting your hands on one? That was another story. Parents lined up at dawn. Some camped overnight. Others sprinted through department stores in scenes more suited to action movies than holiday shopping. There were arguments, tears, the occasional tackle, and when someone finally scored a doll, they clutched it like it was made of gold. Kids loved them. They named them, dressed them, and carried them everywhere. Some families had to settle for knockoffs with names like Garden Patch Pals that never quite felt the same. But if you had a real one, you were a legend. Looking back, it seems wild that a doll caused so much chaos. But in that moment, nothing mattered more. Cabbage Patch Kids were not just toys. They were trophies. Proof that your parents had braved the crowds and won. And decades later, those round faces still sit on shelves, quietly remembering the madness they caused. They were not just for carrying sandwiches and juice boxes. They were badges of honor. In the 1970s, metal lunchboxes with cartoon characters were everything to a kid. You marched into school like you owned the place if you had the Brady Bunch, Scooby-Doo, or Fat Albert slung over your arm. They clanged when you walked, chipped when you dropped them, and smelled like peanut butter forever. But they were yours. The thermos inside matched the design, with a plastic cup that screwed on top and often leaked just enough milk to give the lunchbox that signature sour scent. You would line them up on the windowsill during class or hide secret notes inside the lid. The paint would eventually chip, the latches would rust, but you never wanted to give it up. Today, they have been replaced by soft-sided, logo-free lunch carriers. But for those who grew up in that era, seeing one again brings back the sound of the bell, the taste of a bologna sandwich, and that magical feeling of opening your box and hoping you got a Hostess cupcake instead of raisins. They were loud, proud, and deeply personal. One glance at the dented metal, and the memories rush back like a school bell in September. The bell would ring, but you were told to stay. No phone call, no warning. You just had to wait. In the 1970s, teachers had full authority to hold students after school, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours. If you talked too much in class or missed a question, you were told to stick around. It was called detention, but there was no formal process. No slip, no log. Parents were not notified. And if they were waiting outside in the car, well, they just had to wait too. Some students missed buses, some missed after-school jobs, and some got in trouble at home for being late without explanation. But teachers did not see it that way. They thought of it as a rightful punishment, an extension of their classroom power. The logic was simple. If you misbehaved on their time, they would take some of yours. Today, keeping a student after school without parent permission would be seen as a serious issue. Liability, safety, trust. But back then, it was just part of the routine. And for kids who were scared to speak up or had no way home except walking miles alone, it was more than just inconvenient. It was unfair and often unsafe. Get yourself a bowl of cereal, always from a brightly colored box featuring a sugar-charged cartoon mascot. But it was not just about what you poured. It was what you poured it into. Saturday morning cereal bowls were branded, oversized, and beloved. They had the logos, the characters, sometimes even games printed inside. Trix, Fruity Pebbles, Super Sugar Crisp, each had its own bowl. You held it like a trophy. You filled it past the brim. The milk turned a strange color. The spoon clinked loudly. And the real show? It was waiting for you in the living room. Schoolhouse Rock, the Super Friends, the Bugs Bunny and Roadrunner Hour. You balanced the bowl on your knees, dripping milk on the carpet, eyes glued to the screen. Parents still asleep, the sun barely up. This was your time. The cereal was sweet, the cartoons were loud, and the bowl made it official. Some were premiums you mailed away for. Others came as prizes. But they all had one thing in common. They turned breakfast into a weekly holiday. That bowl was not just dishware. It was a ticket to your favorite time of the week. Before graphic folders and plastic sleeves, you had brown paper bag book covers. Your mom might have made them for you, folding grocery bags with military precision and taping the flaps down tight. Or maybe you did it yourself, badly, ending up with crooked corners and tears before week 2. In the 1970s, this was just part of school life. Your textbooks came with rules. No writing in them, no bent pages, and definitely no torn covers. So everyone wrapped them. Then came the best part, decorating. You drew bubble letters, band logos, rainbows, or hearts with your crush's initials. Some kids went all out with colored pens and stickers. Others kept it simple. It was more than protection. It was personal. Your book cover became a walking billboard for your personality. You carried that thing everywhere, math, science, social studies. And when the teacher said, "Take out your textbook," there it was, wrapped, taped, drawn on, and uniquely yours. Sometimes it ripped halfway through the year. Sometimes it lasted till June. But no matter what, the act of covering your book felt like a quiet ritual, something ordinary that made you feel a little more in control. The hallway before class was always buzzing. But tucked in every corridor or back corner of your classroom was a row of coat hooks and cubbies, tiny storage spaces that somehow held your whole world. Your puffy jacket, your metal lunchbox, your gym shoes in a brown paper bag, all jammed in together like puzzle pieces. In the 1970s, lockers were not for everyone. A simple hook and a wooden cubby did the trick. You recognized your space without needing a name tag. Maybe it was the one under the fire escape poster. Maybe it still had a sticker from the kid who used it last year. It smelled like wet wool, pencil shavings, and peanut butter. And when you bent down to grab your stuff, you felt safe, hidden, like you had a tiny piece of real estate in the school. You started and ended every day there, drop off, pick up, a small routine that bookended everything. If someone else took your spot, you noticed. Because that hook and cubby were yours, even if they belonged to everyone. Believe it or not, some teachers smoked during class, not just outside, not just during breaks. Right there in the room, ashtray on the desk, cigarette between fingers, lecture going on like nothing was wrong. The smell hung heavy in the air. Students coughed, eyes watered, but no one dared say anything. After all, this was the teacher's space. And back then, cigarettes were not seen as dangerous. They were a lifestyle, a stress reliever, a right. There were classrooms with open windows and fans that barely helped, and you could always tell which rooms had that teacher, the one who lit up after the bell and smoked all the way through silent reading. sometimes even while grading your paper. This was not a back alley habit, it was a school day normal. The cigarette breaks never really stopped. They just followed students back into the room. And the lesson it taught? Your health came second. It seems unthinkable now, but it was perfectly normal then. No one talked about secondhand smoke. No one asked kids how it made them feel. Today, the idea of smoking anywhere near a student is grounds for instant removal. But back then, it was part of the routine. Kids went home with their clothes smelling like tobacco and chalk, and somehow nobody thought twice about it. The Sears Wish Book was not just a catalog, it was a dream machine. When that thick holiday edition arrived in the mail, it was like the door to another universe had opened. You grabbed it before anyone else could. You flipped to the toy section immediately, no time for sweaters or tools. The pages were glossy, the pictures were perfect. There were action figures, dollhouses, bikes, race car tracks, and board games stacked in impossible abundance. You circled your favorites with a crayon. You wrote your name next to them, like that would make a difference. You made lists, you dropped hints, you dreamed big, and even if you knew you would not get half the things in there, that never stopped the hope. The Wish Book was a fantasy, but it felt real. It made December feel closer. It made you believe. It was not just for kids either. Parents pored over it too, marking pages, planning budgets, whispering over breakfast about what might be possible. The book itself got worn and creased, pages torn, the toy section barely holding on. But it stayed on the coffee table all season long, because sometimes just wishing was enough. And in the 1970s, that one catalog carried a whole generation's hopes between its pages. You may not have had a paycheck, but in the 1970s classroom, you definitely had a job. The classroom jobs chart was a rotating system of responsibility and prestige. Line leader, door holder, chalkboard cleaner, paper passer. Oh yeah, these were roles you fought for. The chart hung proudly by the blackboard, usually hand-drawn by the teacher with construction paper and colorful pushpins. Everyone got their turn. And when it was your week, you took it seriously. Carrying the attendance sheet to the office felt like a government mission. Holding the door made you feel like royalty. Cleaning the chalkboard? That was sacred. You got to use the eraser, maybe even the spray bottle. These tiny jobs taught you accountability, teamwork, and how to enjoy being part of something. Some kids tried to trade duties. Others just hoped their name would finally land on Messenger. Even the slackers perked up when the jobs chart got updated, because it was more than chores, it was belonging. It made the classroom feel like its own little world. And in that world, everyone had a part to play. Sometimes it felt like a blessing. The lights would dim, the reel would start, and for 90 minutes, you were off the hook. But more often than not, these movies had nothing to do with the subject. Teachers showed old comedies, action flicks, cartoons, whatever they had in the cabinet. No lesson plans, no follow-up questions, just filler. Something to keep the class quiet while the teacher caught up on grading or took a mental break. You watched Herbie Rides again in math class, or an old black and white western in science. At the time, it felt like a break from the pressure, but it was also a break from learning. These movies were not used to spark discussion or enhance curriculum. They were stand-ins for teaching, substitutes for effort, and for kids who needed structure or support, it meant losing another day of progress. Today, schools have strict guidelines around media in classrooms. Teachers need to tie it to learning objectives. But in the 1970s, no one questioned it. A movie day was just part of the cycle. And the irony? Some students ended up remembering those movies more vividly than the lessons that got skipped. Because what stuck was not the plot, but the message that your time, your education, and your focus could be set aside whenever it was convenient for someone else. Before insulated bags and bendy ice packs, you had a metal lunchbox, and it said everything about you. In the 1970s, a lunchbox was more than a container. It was a bold, clunky rectangle of personality. Scooby-Doo? The $6 Million Man? Maybe Wonder Woman if you were one of the cool ones. And inside that heavy metal case was a matching thermos that clicked shut and could keep soup warm or spill milk everywhere depending on the day. Your mom might have packed you a peanut butter and jelly sandwich in wax paper, a bag of pretzels, and an apple so bruised it looked like it had seen combat. And that was lunch. But that box, oh, it took a beating. It rolled down staircases, got sat on, slammed into lockers, and was sometimes used as a substitute football. By the time you made it to spring, the paint was chipped, the character's face was half scratched off, and the thermos smelled permanently like tomato soup. But you kept it. Every lunch period was a lineup of pop culture on the cafeteria table, and heaven help the kid who showed up with just a brown bag. That was social exile. Those metal lunch boxes were noisy, dented, and always too small, but they carried our childhoods inside them, one squashed sandwich at a time. Backyard fun in the 1970s was loud, chaotic, and often a little dangerous. Enter the water wiggle. It looked innocent enough, a smiling plastic head connected to a long hose. But the moment the water was turned on, it became a wild, whipping, serpentine menace. It sprayed water in every direction and flailed unpredictably, turning the yard into a circus of screams and soaked clothes. Kids chased it. It chased them back. You never knew where it would go. One second it was dancing in the air. The next it was smacking you in the shins. It had one job, to create watery mayhem, and it was great at it. Parents watched from porches, laughing or nervously sipping iced tea. Some turned the pressure down. Others cranked it up. Either way, you ended up drenched. There were no safety labels or slow modes, just you, the hose, and the wiggling chaos that could knock over toddlers and send dogs running. It was thrilling, it was unpredictable, and it was absolutely beloved. They do not make toys like that anymore, probably for good reason. But those summer afternoons when laughter mixed with shrieks and the sprinkler twisted through the air like a possessed noodle, those are hard to forget. If terror had a sound in elementary school, it was that fire drill air horn. It came without warning, one deafening burst that sent books flying and kids jumping out of their seats like popcorn. In the 1970s, fire drills were not polite little chimes. They were loud, harsh, impossible to ignore. Teachers would scramble to line you up, shouting over the noise while someone grabbed the emergency folder from the wall. You stood in single file, sometimes still clutching your pencil or worksheet, marching outside like tiny soldiers with confused faces. It did not matter how many times you practiced. It always felt a little too real. Some kids made jokes, others looked worried. Everyone counted heads. The teacher would click off names with a pen on a clipboard while the horn kept blaring behind you. And then came the all clear. Back inside. Just like that, the world reset. But that noise stayed in your bones. There was something about those old school air horns that made the drill feel important, like it mattered. Like maybe, just maybe, you were learning how to save your own life. And weirdly, that always stuck with you. There was nothing more nerve-wracking in the 1970s than report card day, except maybe hearing your teacher read yours out loud. Yes, out loud. Teachers would go name by name, calling students to the front, or worse, just announcing the comments straight from their grade books in front of everyone. If you had a glowing review, you might walk away with a proud smile. But if your comments said things like disruptive, lazy, or needs improvement, that walk back to your seat felt like a slow-motion march through shame. Everyone heard it. Everyone laughed or stared. Even the kind teachers thought it was just part of the routine. But what they did not realize, or did not care about, was that those few words stuck. One sentence from a tired adult could define a kid for the whole year, and for some, even longer. Teachers called it feedback, but what it really was exposure. Not just your grades, but your behavior, your habits, your struggles, your business. Today, this would violate privacy laws and ethical standards. Schools now protect student records carefully, but back then, your reputation could rise or fall based on a teacher's tone of voice in front of your peers. There was no consent, no warning. just a wave of humiliation that sometimes felt worse than the grade itself. And for many kids, those words were the ones they carried into every class after that, no matter how hard they worked to change. If even one of these classroom throwbacks made you laugh, cringe, or suddenly smell ditto ink again, drop your favorite in the comments. Give us a like if you ever survived a tetherball bruise, and subscribe so you never miss another trip down memory lane.